Right, Seth, welcome to the Easy Conversations podcast. Thank you for joining me this morning. I'm really excited about our conversation. I think there's a lot of depth to your story, and I'm sure a lot of people will be able to get something out of it in terms of the ability to be resilient and power through a lot of the adversity that life often throws at us. And obviously, everyone's story is different. But yeah, I'm looking forward to sharing yours with the listeners today. And before we get into it, I do want to give you an opportunity to share with the listeners a little bit about yourself and what's brought you here and what you're doing now in terms of life.
Yeah, so my name's Seth Gehle. I am what brought me here is I'm writing a book right now. So I'm writing a book and trying to get my message out and help people heal and overcome trauma, tragedy, hard times in life, just any adversity that somebody may have faced. I have faced a lot of adversity and traumatic events in my life, and so I feel compelled to share my story because I've found success and happiness and a good life on the other end of all of that, where a lot of people struggle to find that part of life.
hmm Yeah, and I want to navigate that, and we'll definitely come back to the message of your book. But if you don't mind sharing a little bit about early in life, what was that adversity that you experienced and how it was in terms of what you internalized about yourself too, if we can get into that a little bit as well.
Yeah, so my childhood kicked off pretty quick. My mom had me and my two sisters all back to back, so she had us within, I don't know, 3 years and some change. And my mom and my father got into a fight when I was around 1 or 2 years old, and he stabbed her behind the ear with a knife. So he went to prison for that. I don't really know how long. I just don't have any memories of growing up with him. Because she was a single mother of three kids, we bounced around a lot. We had a lot of different babysitters, and we didn't have a lot of money. So I was unfortunately molested by a one of our babysitters' teenage children. He was he was like maybe 15 or 16, and so that happened. That happened a few times. It wasn't anything really serious. It was kind of just him touching me, making me touch him, and then exposing and things like that. It wasn't anything really intense in regards to molestation goes. Then, around 7 or 8 years old, I met my father. He was in prison when I met him, so I go to the jail. Get to see my father through the plexiglass, talking on this telephone, and that was my first experience meeting my father. And then after that, around 9 or 10 years old, my mom suddenly became like really abusive. She started to get into heavier and harder drugs. She had always smoked weed and always drank a lot, and we always had a lot of people in the house smoking and drinking with her. That was really normal. But around 9 or 10 years old, she started to get like more abusive, and she started to get into harder drugs like crack cocaine. So around that same time, because she was getting so abusive, I started to look outside of the house. I would go to other friends' houses as much as I could, and I found myself at a friend's house down the street, and he was about 5 years older than me. And for the sake of this story, I'll say his name is Jacob. But I meet Jacob, and Jacob knows that I have a pretty tough life at home. So Jacob decides to try to like take me under his wing and protect me, basically. And he was about, like I said, he's about 15. I was about 10. So I'm hanging out with Jacob for a little while, and he introduces me to this man who comes over to his house one day. He's in his 30s. He's like 6'5", 380 pounds. He walks in. He's an Hispanic guy, but he's got a really pale, like white complexion, but you can tell he's Hispanic. And he walks in and he introduces himself to me, and we find some commonalities really quick. We both like video games. We both like pizza, pop, all that stuff. So he invites me to go to his house with Jacob. This older man, his name is, we called him Mondo, and that was his nickname that we called him. So he invites Jacob and I to go to his house, and my mom says it's okay as long as I'm with Jacob because Jacob was my older friend. So I started going to his house, and when I met him, started hanging out with him, I basically hung out with him every single weekend from that point forward up until I was almost 16 years old. And that entire time, well, not the entire time, but about 3 months into hanging out with him, I started hanging out by myself, and that's when he started to molest me as well. So this older man, he's in his mid 30s. I was 10 years old. He starts to molest me, and that goes on for the next almost 6 years of my life. And about halfway through there, when I turned about 12, or excuse me, when I was 12 and I was maybe 6 months away from being 13, my mom gets into a fight with her boyfriend over some drugs in the bathroom. So she ends up stabbing him in the stomach over some drugs. And all I can remember from that, well, I can remember a lot from that day, but the major details are like walking outside and seeing this guy on my front porch with blood on his shirt, and then seeing my mom come outside. She's yelling and screaming. There's a fire in the front yard. She had set some of his stuff on fire in the front yard. And, the police show up and the police take her away. So, from the time I was 10 until 12 years old, my mom had been using drugs and was very abusive, like I said. And during this time, I had seen so many like drug addicts, things like that, people like that coming in and out of the house every single day. A lot of people passed out on my couch asleep from being high. A lot of people using drugs in the bathroom. So that was something that I witnessed every day of my life. So Monday through Friday, I was kind of living with my mom in one hell, dealing with the abuse, the violence, and the drugs. And then Friday night, Saturday night, I would go to this guy's house, Mondo's house. He would come and pick me up, and then he would abuse me and molest me at his house. So I was kind of trapped between a rock and a hard place, for lack of a better term. And I was like escaping one hell, going to another. And that house that I lived in with my mom, for context, I slept in a room that had a 4 foot hole in the ceiling. It was about four. It was about a 4 foot by 2 foot hole up in the corner of my ceiling in my bedroom, and so the rain and snow, the cold wind would whip like right into my room. And I slept on this little 4-inch mattress with a thin blanket, wet the bed every night. It was just an absolutely like horrific experience. So I that all ended when I was around somewhere between 12 and 13. My mom was taken away. And then for the next 4 or 5 months, I bounced around several houses, and I ended up at my grandparents' house. When I landed at my grandparents' house, they asked to adopt me, and I said yes. I wanted them to adopt me.
Mhm.
And then I told them that I wanted to hang out with my friend Mondo, and so they wanted to meet him. So they meet him first. He makes them laugh and makes them smile, and basically earns their acceptance because they were cautious. They were like, why are you hanging out with this old man? I defended the guy, and there's a lot into that of why you defend your abuser and all those different things. So I defended him, and they say it's okay. So I continue hanging out with him, and that would go on for another 3 years or so, almost 3 years. And about a month away from being 16, I was up at his house. By this time, he had done everything you can do to somebody in regards to the like sexual realm of things. I had experienced everything that you can, the worst ways. By the time I was really 13 years old was when we had done everything. And by the time I was 16, it had been reciprocated probably 300, 400 times over the course of 5.5 years. And so when I turned six, or right before I turned 16, I was up at his house, and I had this younger friend that was up there with me. And the guy starts making comments towards my younger friend, and he starts to make these like jokes and these grooming comments that he had made towards me throughout the years that I had known him. So I knew what was about to happen, and I'm kind of hanging out, and I see the kid go back to his room. So I decided to speak up, and the next day I reported him because I couldn't stomach another child going through what I had went through. I couldn't handle that. So to protect my friend, I went home that next day, and I reported him. And the whole reporting process, that's a whole another story. But yeah, we went to the hospital and did everything, did the DNA test and all that. And he had molested me and actually raped me that weekend, the last weekend that I was at his house. And so when I went to the hospital, I told them that, and I told them that I did not take a shower, I didn't change my clothes because I knew that I was going to go home and finally report him. And so I did. and they got everything that they needed. They went up and arrested him. He admits a little bit of guilt that same night, but then like a month later, he pleads guilty to 11 counts of misconduct with a minor,
Mhm.
and he was sentenced to 10 years in prison, and that was back in 2011. So he would be free today. Fortunately enough, he died in prison in 2019. So he never made it out of prison, thankfully. But that was really the end of my traumatic experience as a child. So for almost 16 years, I just lived in this like not a great place. I never had parents that really were present and good parents and loving. Drugs, violence, abuse. I mean, just everything I had experienced by the time I was 16. And it finally ended
Mhm.
when I reported him.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, thank you for sharing all that. And I guess one of the things I would like to understand is what's compelled you now to share your story. And I know part of it is to help others, but as you were going through those experiences early on in life, trying to make sense of it, what's allowed you to now come forward and share all of this, not only for yourself, but others?
Yeah, that's a good question. You know, I always knew I was going to write a book one day because I had such a crazy life. I was like, man, this is something I know that other people are not experiencing, and that they could.
Yeah.
This would make a. I mean, this is going to be a crazy story one day. I knew that I knew that when I was young, and so as I started writing my book, I started to get really bad anxiety. I started to get really scared of telling people that this happened to me. I could always talk about the drugs, the violence, the abuse from my mom because there's nothing real. There's no like shame or anything attached to that. But the sexual abuse thing with a man, and I did it, it happened to me from a man. So that part has that inherent shame attached to it. So I've never told anybody about that until like 6 months ago. So when I was writing my book, that's obviously really the biggest part of the book is going through all of that. And I wanted to like publish my book and have everything come out at the same time. But and I was getting so much anxiety that when my book came out, everybody was going to have all these opinions about me and they're going to think all these different things. So I decided that I just needed to say something. I spoke up because I saw another man who looked like a tough grown man speak about his situation, and he spoke about it in the same way that I do, which is real direct, really direct and forward about it, and he's not a victim to his circumstances. So when I saw another man do that, that's what kind of empowered me because he made so much impact on me. So now, you know, that's kind of how I was like, you know what, it's time. It's time for me to just say something. It's time for me to get this off my chest and let the world know because I want to be a motivational speaker. I want to write a book. I want to change people's lives. I can't do that unless I am completely transparent so that people really understand where I'm coming from and why I am the way that I am. So,
Mhm.
just to wrap that all up, statistically speaking, it's 1 in 4 boys and 1 in 3 girls that go through what I went through. And so that's nearly 4 billion people in the world right now that have experienced my pain. And every time I do an interview or anything, I get messages just flooded with me too, me too, me too, me too, and just people just pouring their hearts out to me in the comments or on DMs about their situation and how me telling my story and telling it as graphically as I do
Mhm.
has helped them understand themselves and understand the process and that they're not alone. So it's incredibly humbling to be like that lighthouse for somebody.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I appreciate that. And what you're sharing here is just similar to how you were empowered by listening to this other man. You're trying to empower others. And you touched on the shame. And I suppose there's a couple of themes here I do want to tie together and obviously explore a little bit more about your story. But you touched on how earlier when you introduced this man to your grandparents, there's this idea of even though he was your abuser, you felt this need to protect him in a way. And a lot of people that experience shame, how do you tie the two together? Because you said there was this aspect of shame, and I wonder if that still comes up for you. And then maybe if we can tie it to the second point around for other people that are in similar situations, how do they navigate that? Okay, this is my abuser, and be able to separate themselves from that. So a couple of questions there, but yeah.
Yeah, so when I got to my grandparents' house and I wanted to hang out with that guy, he comes over, he meets him. I defended him, and I had defended him from my mom before and my dad as well. I saw my dad for a brief moment, before I got to my grandparents' house, and they all questioned the situation as well. But a 10-year-old, 11, 12-year-old boy, a child that doesn't have two parents at home, doesn't have a foundation, doesn't have leadership and guidance in their life, you can pretty much convince them to do whatever you want them to do. You can convince them to sell drugs, kill people, hurt other people. You can convince them to do anything, and you don't even have to really threaten them. It doesn't have to be in a threatening way. So that's kind of why I was so protective of him, of my abuser, because we had commonalities. We both had the same likes. We both liked football, video games, pizza, those kind of things, right? But also because I confided in him and he knew that I didn't have a father in my life, he knew that my mom was abusive and addicted. He would reiterate those same things to me about his life. I don't know how true they were, but that's what he would tell me, right? So he would say, "Oh, I get where you're coming from because my mom did this and I don't have a father. My father, whatever, this and that when he was a kid." So I could have told him that I could have told him anything, and I think he probably would have said the same thing about himself to build that commonality. It's just like if you're trying to interrogate a criminal, you don't get the criminal to confess by attacking them. You get on the same level as them, right? And then they feel comfortable talking to you. And so that's what he did to me, and and that is why I defended him. I felt terrible for him on some. I felt terrible for him on the days that he would guilt me into like, how are we going to keep seeing? Because when I got to my grandparents' house, he would say, how are we going to keep seeing each other? Can I still come and see you? And I miss you. And he would tell me like he told me he loved me and that I was the most important thing in the world to him. And at 12 years old, I'm thinking to myself, and he would tell me he would tell me that he was going to kill himself if he couldn't have me, if he couldn't see me. So at 12 years old, I'm trying to navigate all these emotions, and I'm just like, by that time, I hated going to his house because the molestation was so bad and it was so intense. I hated it. Um, so I hated going there, but I had to. It's almost like this compelling force that they do. I don't even know. It's so hard to explain the amount of like stress and anxiety that it pulls on your brain. He would call me and tell me that he needs to see me and that he loved me and how much he needed me in his life. And so because of all of those things, I defended him and I protected him.
Mhm.
I didn't want to be the reason that he got hurt. Plus, when you're so it's like robbing a bank. When you get in and you pull the gun out, you're already there and you're already committed. So if you back out now, like you're still going to get caught. People are still going to know that you robbed the bank. So you might as well keep going. And for me, because I was already invested in the relationship after a year or two, if I just stopped hanging out with him suddenly, people are going to ask, wait, what happened? Why did you stop hanging out with him? Why aren't you hanging out anymore? And then that might come out because I was scared to tell people that it happened to me for many, many reasons. So that was also part of the reason why I defended him. I was not only defending him, but I was defending myself, right? Because if somebody says, "Hey, why are you hanging out with that old man?" and I say he's doing this to me, they're going to think that I'm weird too. They're going to think that there's something wrong with me. So not only was I defending him, but I was defending myself by protecting him.
Mhm.
So that's a lot of it, man. I mean, I kind
Yeah.
of just
Yeah.
came up with that revelation now as I'm talking about it,
Yeah.
which I think is
Yeah.
the beauty of like therapy and talking and processing and podcasting. So,
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, yeah, and I think that's where the shame creeps in, right? So that's the second part of the question where you were, and I think that shame obviously carried on, and it's probably something that you still try to wrestle with, but that was it in terms of not being able to open up about it and share what was going on. It seems like you were trying to avoid the shame that would have come with saying, "Hey, this is what's going on in this relationship that I have with this individual." So how have you then navigated that shame, and is it something that you deal with on a daily basis? Because anytime you have to talk about it or share your story, does that creep in?
There is no shame anymore. I have no shame whatsoever anymore. 6 months ago, when I first talked about this like publicly, I did it actually the first time I ever talked about this publicly. I did it in front of three cameras in a podcast setting, And if you watch that video on YouTube, you can see that I was just torn apart, like shaking, stumbling across my words. I broke down in the video 3 or 4 times, crying very hard. There was a lot of pain that I had to get out of my body. And now that I've talked about it so many times, I'm good. Like it's not a big deal, because it's like it's almost like you've done something wrong and you have this guilt and you have this thing that's like this guilty conscience, right? And if anybody finds out, they're going to think the worst of you. But then you tell somebody and they're like, hey, it's not a big deal. Like, we don't really care that that happened to you. And not in a bad way, but like my friends, for example, they don't care that that happened to 10-year-old Seth. They just know Seth today. Like, and as a matter of fact, they have a little bit more respect for me because of what I went through and the person that I am today. So now I don't have the shame, but before I talked about it, yes, because I didn't want to tell anybody. But as soon as you speak it out loud into the universe, it's gone. Like the shame just dissipates. It's gone. So it's really helped me speaking on it.
Yeah, and that's your message, I'm assuming, to everyone who's experienced something similar or is going through something similar. And that's, I think, the idea with anxiety too, right? We create this notion in our head that it's this worst case scenario, but in fact, it's not as bad as we think. And to your point, the more you've opened up about it, the more you've realized that people have still accepted you and still respect you. In fact, even more because of what you've been able to come through and what you're doing with your story and trying to empower others. Now, just kind of going back to those that childhood time, where were your sisters in all of this? Because I know you mentioned there were two older sisters.
So I was a middle child. My younger
Okay.
sister's a year younger. My older sister's
Yeah.
a year older.
Yeah.
Um, we were all together the whole time. Now, when I went to Mondo's house, I went by myself. They never hung out with him. And when my mom was taken away, all three of us went to my dad's house for a brief moment. We went there. I got into a bunch of trouble at school within like 2 or 3 weeks. I got sent to alternative school. Was told I was going to be arrested if I got in trouble again. So I had to leave that town. My sister stayed with my father. I left and I bounced around for about 3 or 4 months to different houses, different places. And then we ended up at my grandparents' house about 4 or 5 months later. And I didn't even know that they were at my grandparents' house. When I got there, I saw them and I was like, oh, holy crap. I was like, we all made it. Like, I was really excited for all three of us because we had finally made it out of mom's house and, in a safe place with food and all the necessities, right? Unfortunately, within like a week or two, they told my grandparents they wanted to go back and live with my mom. My mom was out of jail at this point. So they go back. My grandma takes them back and drops them off at my mom's house. And they went back and stayed with my mom. And I have not had a relationship with them since then, really. I've tried to help them a few times throughout life, but they are making decisions that don't align with my life. And, I'm not going to drag them. I'm not going to say anything bad other than that they've just made decisions that I don't agree with. And, they are stuck. I would say they're stuck in the mud, maybe. And I've tried to help, but they just don't want to accept it. So we don't really have much of a relationship now.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So, what do you think was different for you as opposed for them? Like, what allowed you to be considering everything else you went through on top of the issues with the parents? What's allowed you to come out on a differently, I suppose, from the experiences?
Yeah, oddly enough, this is probably one of the hardest things that I've had to process about my situation was because my abuser Mondo, as bad as he was for me, he was also at the same time one of the best things that happened to me, which is really crazy to think about because he had mentored me so much. He mentored me so much throughout my childhood from the time he first met me. He would coach me through getting bullied at school, getting bullied at home, or I wanted to kill myself all the time. So he would coach me through these kind of things. Like he was like coaching me through life and teaching me a lot about life, and really good things too. He would give me a lot of great advice. And even when I got to my grandparents' house, he would coach me through that process, because when I got to my grandparents, they were so nice to me that I hated them. I hated how nice my grandparents were. I was like 12 years old, 13 years old, and I was thinking, I'm a grown man. Like, I don't need you to sing happy birthday to me and make me a cake. Like, I just hated this nice household that I was in.
Mhm.
And he even coached me through that process. He's like, you're in a home that people love you. Like, you need to respect that and understand that and cherish that. So, as bad as he was for me, he coached me through a lot of that. And I honestly, if he wasn't there for me, I don't know if I would have made it out of my mom's house, which is just crazy to think about, right? Because he was damaging me the same time he was also saving me every weekend. And I would talk to him throughout the week as well. Several times throughout the week, I talked to him on the phone, and he would just coach me through all these hard times in my life. And looking back on it, it was probably to get what he wanted out of it, at the end of the day, because if I take my own life or stop going to his house, then he loses that joy that he gets out of whatever he was doing to me, right? The dark side of it, right? So it's like a weird like dichotomy, the relationship that we had.
Mhm.
But I think that that was probably one of the bigger reasons that I stuck on the path that I stuck on, of being a good kid, taking care of school, staying with my grandparents, because I almost left my grandparents' house while living with them. And so him, and then I had I ever since I was younger, I had always done better than my sisters. So even as young as like 8, 9, 10 years old, 11 years old, I was always a straight A student. I was always a perfect student in school. I got in a lot of fights, but as far as academics went, I was really good. I was very smart as a young man. And my sisters, they just did not care about school. They just didn't care about it. And they also started smoking weed with my mom around 10, 11 years old too. So my two sisters would sit in the living room and smoke weed with all these adults. And I just never wanted any part of it. Like at school, they talked about the DARE program back in the day, which is like the drug awareness, whatever program. That was really big. And I did so because of that, I didn't want to do any drugs. I didn't want any part of it. I don't know why at such a young age. I just didn't want any part of it, and I never did. I never wanted to mess with drugs, even as I got into my teenage years. Um, and I think that my sisters were so connected to my mom because it was that mother daughter relationship. And I did not have that connection, maybe. I don't know. I was always headstrong to a lot of the situations that we were in.
Yeah. Yeah. And just talking about this Mondo guy again, you said he was mentoring you. Do you think that was also a reason that you felt compelled to protect him because he was serving a different role in your life as well?
That's a good point. Yeah. That is, there's probably something to that. I'm trying to think. It's so hard to go back. It was like 13 years
Yeah.
ago. It's so hard to go back in there and think about why I protected him so diligently.
Mhm.
Yeah, part of it was he was such a nice guy. He seemed so nice and caring, and he had the best advice about things, and I mean he was very smart. Honestly, he could tell you anything about anything. I mean he was incredibly smart, and everybody loved him. All We had multiple friend groups. We had other adult friends as well that loved him. He was funny. He was the life of the party. Every time we went somewhere, he could do no wrong. That so there was a lot to that, and he offered advice to many, many people, and he was just really smart, and everybody always listened when he spoke. So everybody had a lot of respect for him, and you know that also makes it hard to go against the grain. Like why would you report somebody who is so liked by everyone?
Right. Yeah.
So you're so scared of rejection and denial.
Yeah. Yeah. Because you were probably thinking, or I mean, I don't know if that crossed your mind that would people even believe me knowing this guy and how well he's liked? And I'm wondering if there was also an aspect of you mentioned some of the things, but as children, well, in general, all of us as humans, but children especially, want to be seen, heard, and understood, especially in those early formative years. And this person was fulfilling that for you, whereas your parents weren't there, right? And they had their own stuff going on. How much of that also played into that relationship? Because now you have this adult male figure in your life that you haven't had your whole childhood, serving this role of being around, giving you advice, understanding you, seeing you, and some of the things you shared in terms of what you guys had in common, whether or not he played that up a little bit or it was made up. But from your perspective, there was this person who actually understood you, and you were finally seen as a child. And it doesn't excuse any of the things he was doing, but as a child, for you, that was the first time you were seen, right?
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah, and that was cool. Like, and just like you said, I everything I said was cool to him. Everything I said was important to him. I could call him whenever I needed to, and he was listening to me. And whenever I would go to his house, I could get whatever food I wanted, any kind of energy drinks, pops, coffee. Like, I could cuss, I could do all these things that kids typically can't do, and I just felt like I felt like an empowered young man. Like, I was like with my best friend who we could do anything together. We could do whatever we wanted to do together. So yeah, a lot of that was being seen and heard, and we would talk for hours. I mean, we'd have very deep conversations at even at that young age, 10, 12, 14. We'd have very, very deep conversations. And so it did make me feel good to be around somebody who wanted to have those conversations and valued my input.
Hmm. Yeah. And when you said you're kind of moving to your grandparents' home and they were showering you with love, that just felt different to you because that's not something you'd experienced and probably something you had internalized. Why was it so hard for you to accept it? And I'm assuming part of it was you were familiar with the role your mom was playing, and this just felt different. Did you feel like part of you, did you feel you weren't deserving of it?
Probably not the deserving part, maybe not so much. I still deal with this today. As a matter of fact, I'm on vacation right now, right? And I'm here with my in-laws and my wife and her family, and I am better at dealing with it now. But just 6 months ago, before I started talking and kind of really handling a lot of these emotions, even today, I would struggle with being around a family environment, like a real family environment, because for me, it's a multitude of things. One of them is I never had that, so I have this, like, not like traumatic response to it, but this really sad feeling I get sometimes because I'm around a bunch of people that are all family, and I look at everybody who's younger than me, and I'm just like, man, I wish I could have had that growing up. I wish I would have had that family vacation every year. I wish I would have had the whole grandma and grandpa, great grandma and grandpa, cousins, and all the things, right? And I never had that. So part of that was that. And even when I lived with my grandparents at 12, 13 years old, that was a lot of it. My grandparents were a husband and a wife taking care of me like a mom and a father.
Hmm.
And they were so caring and accountable. The accountability that they would hold me to, I was unfamiliar with it. I was unfamiliar with all the good things. If they would have just treated me like shit, I would have been like, oh yeah, this is good, because that's you're used to that. You're used to that hell.
Yeah.
It's like the devil you know versus the one you don't. I was used to the one that I knew, that I wanted to be treated like shit, and I wanted to have a hard life. And when you're presented with good things in life, sometimes it's hard. I can imagine even being addicted or an alcoholic or something like that. When you get off the drugs, your life suddenly becomes better, right? Contrarily, you're like, this doesn't feel right. Why are things going so well for me? Why are people happy? Why are people loving me all of a sudden? So then you want to go back into that hell that you're used to. So that's what I dealt with when I lived with my grandparents.
Yeah, yeah, and it's along those same lines. It's interesting that you know you were being abused by this individual for so long, and then your young friend comes into the picture, and you could see something similar developing, and that's when you're like, enough is enough. So I'm wondering how much of it was, again, same thing, right? You're like, okay, I can take this, but I'm not going to see someone else get hurt and go through this. What was going on for you? Like, what do you think? Why do you think that snapped something in you when you saw someone else potentially becoming a victim in this situation?
Yeah, I was that point in my life. I was going through a lot. Like
Mhm.
it had been going on for 5.5 years, and I had been raped multiple times by that, and I was raped that weekend that this all happened, and I was getting to my breaking point. It was either going to be me or him. I was either going to take my life or I was going to report him. Like I was certainly getting to that point because it was getting very hard to go to his house. I mean, I'd hated it for years now, but it was getting very painful and very exhausting. And I don't know why I was so adamant about protecting somebody else over myself. I think that's really common. A lot of people that this happens to, they grow up to be police officers, firefighters, serve in the military. I served in the military, and I just I don't know, man. I just felt like I had to protect him, and I couldn't. I understood the pain and suffering that I had gone through, and I was very like aware of all of those things, and so I couldn't imagine letting it happen to a friend right in front of me. I couldn't do it. So
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah, no, I can appreciate that. And after all that happened, so you've reported him, and now you're kind of starting fresh. You don't have this individual in your life anymore. What did you do? So I know right now you're openly talking about your story, but what have you done between now and then in terms of healing, and what are you continuing to do to heal and move past all of this, it as much as you can, right?
yeah, yeah. So a couple things there. One, I don't think you ever get over it, right? I think I'm serving a life sentence. This is something that'll be a part of my life forever. And with that, you have to understand because it's not going away, you have to learn how to live with it, right? It's like going to prison for the rest of your life. You're going to be there forever. So you might as well learn how to live with it, right? And how to get the good things out of it, how to find that silver lining in there somewhere. And so that's kind of what I've done now. But initially, when it first happened, I mean, I never got any therapy, I never got any help, I never got any counseling, not anything serious, consistent, or intensive. I would have like a one off here and there. I'd go see somebody, but for the most part, I was just moving on. Um, you know, it didn't really affect me for probably 5 years as far as like my mentality went. It affected a lot of my actions and a lot of the ways that I viewed relationships. But I didn't realize that at the time. Looking back on those relationships and looking back on how I acted with like girls, for example, I was very sexually motivated. I thought that every time I talked to a girl, she was in love with me and that like we were going to have sex and it was going to be this great relationship every single time. And I had this really poor outlook on life in regards to that. And I'm not proud of that at all. I try not to say I'm ashamed of it. I'm not proud of how I treated girls in my younger age. Um, so then I ended up meeting my wife when I was around 21, and that was really good for a year or two. I don't think we really had many problems initially in our relationship. Um, but as I've gotten older and I've hit it longer and longer, I've hit that part of my life. It is starting to kind of taking its toll on me, which is the reason why I like to share my story because I waited 13, 14 years to announce that this had happened to me. And not that you have to announce it like I am, but even just to process it and to admit that this is something that happened and admit that this does have impacts on you. A lot of people, traumatic events happen to them, whatever it may be, and they move on, they get past it, and they do great in life, and that's great. However, if they have not gone back and processed what happened to them, it is certainly affecting their day to day actions or their attitude or their relationships, and they just don't see it because they have not gone back and addressed it. So, looking back, I wish I would have. addressed it much earlier in life, because I would have had better relationships. I would have had better, things happen to me throughout life. And that's the importance of it. So the last 6 months, I've done a ton of healing therapy and processing. Nothing. I have not done anything formal, but doing podcasts, doing speaking engagements, having people reach out to me for advice, posting some of my comment or some of my advice on Instagram and YouTube and things like that, and allowing others to see me completely transparent, and then also helping them heal. That has been my therapy. And I'm not. One thing I just want to be clear about too is I'm not any better for doing this. I'm not, and somebody else may not be any worse for not announcing what happened to them. I've had people reach out to me in silence and DMs, and I don't expose them, obviously. And I always tell them, like, hey, like, you're okay. You don't have to do what I'm doing. I am doing it because I'm comfortable with it and I am able to do it. There are some survivors of trauma and abuse and things like that. They can't handle questions. They can't handle certain words or smells or scents and things like that, which is totally understandable. And they are not any less than me because they can't handle those things right now. And like I said, I'm not any better because I can. So that's been my healing. My healing journey, like I said, has been just talking about it, processing it, unpacking those boxes. Like, even just on this podcast, just 10 minutes ago, I kind of uh, just discovered why I may have been protecting him, right? Because I was also protecting my own pride. And that's, so you just opened up a box for me that I have not seen in 13, 14 years, just by asking that question. And we kind of had some conversation and discovered it. And so I'm going to write that down, because I think that's a beautiful part of this whole thing, is like, that's why people protect somebody. Is they don't even want to admit that I'm being abused, or that I'm using drugs, or whatever the situation may be. So that's what's so powerful about speaking. And I process a lot through talking and telling my story. So that's been my healing journey.
Yeah. Yeah, what I'm hearing there is, again, you're not only doing it to help others and empower others, you're also doing it for your own healing. And as you alluded to, just talking through it. And that's why talk therapy is so powerful, that, even as therapists, what we learn is majority of the times the individual themselves, they have the answer. It's just uncovering it, right?
Yeah.
And I mean, my job as a therapist is to guide and have that conversation, but it's not my job necessarily to give the solution, and often that's the case. And in through all of this, your wife has obviously been a huge part of it, especially over the last few years. How has she managed all of this? Because I'm sure this can is affecting her too, in terms of the trauma you deal with on a daily basis. How has she shown up, and how has she managed all of this? Because she's a huge integral
Yeah.
role in your life.
Yeah. So real quick before I answer that, what you just said, I just want to touch on that, because I've talked to so many people, and they'll tell me about therapists, and they'll say, "Screw them! They don't know what they're talking about, or they don't know what I've been through. How can I talk to them?" And they always say the same thing, which is, "I talked for an hour and he didn't even say anything." And it's like, and what you just said is the epitome of, I think, therapy. It's like the answer is inside of you. You just have to get it out. And so that's their job, is to steer that conversation to where it needs to go. And the more you talk, the more they can drive. If you give them the road, they can continue driving it, right? But if you just put the roadblock up, they can't do anything with that. So first off, I think that's incredible. Love that you said that. To answer the question about my wife, so a couple things here too. Kind of funny, when I first met her, I told her within about a month or so of knowing her, I was like, "Hey, like, just so you know, I'm pretty jacked up. Like, I've got a really bad story." And I told her, I said, "If you want to be with me, that's part of my story. Like, I'm just gonna let you know right now, like, I've got some problems." And I can't remember any negativity from her whatsoever. I can't remember her flinching. I can't remember anything, any kind of cautious. She didn't give a shit. She was full in. Like, she didn't care. So I commend her for that. First off, I don't think she understood the gravity of that situation, but you know, she stuck by my side through, well, over 7 years now. And like I said, the first couple of years were really good. We didn't have really, we had our typical arguments and things like that, but sprinkled throughout this 7 years of marriage has been a lot of moments of me projecting my problems onto her and treating her bad. And by treating her bad, I mean like not talking to her for a few days or ignoring her or not being affectionate, things like that. And a lot of that is because I did not address what I had gone through as a child, right? And so since I have, like I said, about 6 months ago, our it almost feels like a new marriage to me because I'm able to like love her and show her affection and talk about her in a way that I've never talked about her before. And even when I first started doing podcasts, 6 months ago, I would always tell everybody like I've got two beautiful kids, I love them to death, and then I have this wife, and that was it. That's all I would say about her. I wouldn't talk about her at all. So for me to show some affection to my wife is actually a huge step for me, which to most people that would be like, it's your wife. Like, what do you mean you can't show affection? But it's weird, man. It just what happened to me messes with your brain and it messes with your heart. So for me to get into that stage of expressing affection and gratitude and love towards her has been really important. But she has stuck by my side. I have not been the best to her in regards to treating, things like that. I wouldn't say I was a horrible husband the last 7 years, but I could have been a lot better. And there's many times where I've not wanted to be in the marriage anymore,
Mhm.
and she, for some reason, argued with me about it, and wanted to fight for me with me. And she's been asked about that as well by some other people, and she just said that she knew I went through a lot as a child and I had a hard time growing up, and that she knew that I was always a good person deep down inside, and that's why she's stuck by my side. But yeah, she has been her and not only her but her family. Her family's incredible. For me, growing up in a broken home, to find the family that I found and her family
Mhm.
has been incredibly rewarding. She's got mom and dad, grandma and grandpa, great grandma and grandpa, and brothers and sisters and cousins and aunts and uncles, and we're all at this beach vacation now. Like I was thinking about that yesterday. We're all at a beach together, and coming from where I come from, and to be in this beach house with all this stuff, and I wouldn't be here without her. I wouldn't be here without her and her family. And so what they've done for me is incredible. And as I've talked about my story, nobody's treated me any different. You know, I'm very lucky to have her. I'm very lucky to have her family.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, yeah, no, I appreciate that too. And again, I think if you kind of look at your life, you didn't really have a ideal of what a relationship looks like growing up, right? So it's something you've had to navigate yourself, and that can be tough, right? And along those same lines, you mentioned two children, and again, not seeing the ideal role modeling around parenting. What are some things you're doing, and what have you focused on as a father to make sure things are different for your children?
Yeah, the biggest thing is loving my children relentlessly. Unconditional isn't the word for it. Unconditional is loving them no matter what, right? But loving them relentlessly is like every single day, all day long, loving the hell out of my children and letting them know that daddy's here, daddy loves you, daddy's going to protect you, picking them up and hugging them and kissing them and just snuggling with them. And all the things are what I try to do as a father. I climbed in bed with my son this morning. We're waking up and just gave him a hug and told him I loved him, and doing those things, just being so present and relentless about my love for him is what I try to do. Because obviously, like you said, I did not have that as a child. I didn't have mom and dad to put me in bed at night. I didn't have somebody to tell me they love me at night and tell me they love me in the morning, and to give me a hug and pick me up throughout the day. I didn't have those things. So being able to do that as a father now is very rewarding. And sometimes it is sad. That's part of having a father wound and having those traumatic experiences is when I hold my son at night, I think about me as a young man, and I wish I would have had that. So sometimes those moments are hard for me. Or when I see my son and my daughter interacting with my wife or her family, like her dad, whenever he interacts with them, for some reason it just it pulls on my heart because I wish I would have had a grandpa that would that space with a father and a grandpa together, like loving and so yeah. I mean, to answer your question, it's just loving them and talking to them, being present, making sure that, like you said, they're heard, seen, and felt. We sit at the dinner table. It's funny. My 4-year-old son will be eating dinner, and he will start the conversation of like, "So, how was everybody's day today?" You know, and that comes from him hearing us. They're gonna monkey see, monkey do. They're gonna repeat what we do. So, yeah. I mean, just being a parent is one of the most important things that you can do in the world. And so when you are blessed with that opportunity, that title, like you really need to understand what you're doing, or and maybe not what you're doing, but the importance and the magnitude of like raising young people and how what they're going to do in this world one day.
Mhm. Yeah, and one of the things you said is children observe us and they'll tend to copy what we're doing. So how much of that plays into knowing that, you didn't see your father or your mother really taking care of themselves and some of the choices they were making? How does that play into your own life choices and what you're doing and how you're role modeling for your children? Like, how has that been for you, and how has it acted as a catalyst in terms of the work you're doing on yourself?
Yeah. So as a young man, I saw the damage that drugs and violence and abuse does, right? So I was always steered away from it. And then even in my adulthood, I've really focused on, especially when my daughter was born. She's older out of the two. I really focused on becoming a better man, becoming a better leader, becoming a better person. So I started reading books on all of these different things, mindset, mentalities, and the psychology of people, and understanding all of those things so I could understand myself, so that I could be a better man and person and father. Um, Oddly enough, the absence of my parents, I think, has empowered me as a parent. I think it has kind of two. You can go two ways with that. It either you repeat the cycle or you break the cycle. And I broke it. I knew that I wanted my kids to be so proud of me. When they're older, and as I've started writing a book, I I've wanted to quit many times. I've wanted to give up so many times because it's expensive and it's hard and it's challenging. But and 15 years from now, like my kids will be able to tell their friends in college or high school or whatever, like, yeah, my dad wrote a book and my dad does this. You know, my dad does all these hard things. Like I've done, I compete in jiu-jitsu and I run ultra marathons, and I want my kids to look at me like this damn superhero. My cool stories from my childhood about my parents was, oh yeah, my mom was smoking crack, or my dad was a convict. My dad spent most of his life in prison. He has all these prison tattoos. Like those were my cool parent stories, that nobody else had, because nobody else's dad was in prison and nobody else's mom was doing XYZ. So for my children, I want them to have cool stories and be able to brag on me that their dad has ran 100 miles before, or he's done these like ultra or jiu-jitsu, and he was in the army and he's wrote a book. Like I want those things, that legacy for me, for my children. Almost selfishly, like I want them to be so proud of me as a father, but the only way they will be proud of me is by leading a good life, and by being healthy and making them healthy and strong, and by doing good things and helping other people. One day they'll know what happened to me, right? When they're old enough to understand that. And that conversation, I'm preparing for it, but it'll be, daddy got hurt. There's bad people in the world. One of them decided to hurt daddy. Daddy's okay now. Daddy's stronger. And daddy is going to help other people become better and become stronger because of what happened. So there's no shame, there's no problem attached to that. And that's, that, like I said, that absence of what I had is what drives me to be such a present and strong, loving father.
Hmm. Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I totally get that. And so coming to now the present, you've got the book out there. You're doing a lot of public speaking. You're sharing your story. What else are you doing? Like, how do you, what's your day to day like, and how do you manage life? And obviously, you've got a young family, and uh, yeah. So, how is it all coming together for you? And I know you touched on the healing. That's an everyday journey, and you can't really run from it. But how are you putting everything together now?
Yeah, so day to day is just keeping up on my health and wellness. First off, we try to eat good and go to the gym every day and train. My wife does the same thing. She works at a gym, and she's running around with the kids every day. Um, I work in the construction industry. I'm an estimator, so I work in an office, and I work for a fantastic company, fortunately enough, that gives me the freedom to do what I want to do outside of work, which is writing this book, public speaking, engaging, networking, things like that. And a lot of my day to day time is spent looking for opportunities to help people, looking for nonprofits to speak for, looking for anybody that needs help to go and help them and speak for them, and be that peer specialist in a way. Be that person that's gone through the events and can speak firsthand from a victim's perspective of how these things feel. So looking for opportunities like that. But it's just one day at a time, man. It's just one day at a time. And I've got my goals in line, which are like writing that book, and that'll be done in a few months. And then big speaking engagements, I've got those goals in mind. Yeah, I don't know if that answers your question. I'm just trying to
Yeah.
just keep it one day at a time. Yeah, I mean, try
Yeah.
not to get overwhelmed.
For sure. And you touched on doing hard things, right? You gave some examples about running marathons and jujitsu, and I find like life is kind of like jujitsu, right? Things that don't make sense at times. When I
Right.
started it, I didn't appreciate the mental challenge that it brings, uh, because you kind of look at it, it's like, okay, it's physically demanding, but I didn't appreciate how mentally demanding it can be, and the chess match that's there. But what do you think is the meaning of all of this, looking back on your life, and how have you, obviously you're living your purpose through the work you're doing now, but what is the meaning of all of this? Have you reflected on that? And I'm sure that answer evolves too as time progresses.
Yeah. What's the meaning, right? Great question. You know, we're only given so much time on Earth. And I spent a lot of that time struggling, spent a lot of that time in the mud and the deep water, trying to survive. So a lot of that, with a limited amount of time on Earth, you've got to do the things that are going to make this time enjoyable. I don't know what happens after this, right? And so sometimes when you think about that, it's like, well, what's the point? Like, what's the point if we don't know what happens? If What's the point? We're only here for this amount of time. Like, why would I? Why do I need to spend my time making other people's lives better? Why can't I just do my own thing and live in my own life and go to a cave and be happy forever? So, that's a good question. I think that some people like myself maybe have this inner drive, passion, desire to save the world, for lack of a better term. I just want to make people happy, and I understand what it's like to be hopeless and to be lost, and to if I could provide a light for anybody, that would mean a lot to me. And I certainly have, because when I was in those dark places, you just don't know where to even begin. You're in a room and you can't even find the light switch. You have no idea what's going on or how to get out. And so for me, that is the meaning of it all. Is the purpose behind what I'm doing. It is just understanding that there are so many people in the world that are experiencing the pain and trauma that I am. How many of them can I save? How many of them can I help? It is not about me anymore. It's about everybody else. It's about what I can do with the time that I've given on this earth. And I hope that I leave a legacy behind that people can respect and admire and be proud of.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely, beautifully said. And Yeah. Thank you so much, Seth, for sharing your story. I don't want to keep you from the beach, but I really appreciate your vulnerability. I know this is something that you aspire to do, but it still means a lot because it takes a lot of courage to be able to share what you've shared and the work you're doing beyond that and in all aspects of your life. So I commend you for that. And thank you again for coming on here and sharing your story with me and the listeners.
Yeah, thank you so much, man. This was an awesome conversation. Thank you.
Yeah, appreciate it.